The Legend of Vox Machina Season 3 is an intense season that once it starts, never stops, or relents, or slows down for its entire 12-episode run. Whilst it weaves interesting character moments and changes what it has to fit hours of tabletop gameplay into its runtime, I came away from Season 3 feeling empty, exhausted, and hollow. Throughout the series up till this point, I've been astounded by the quality of animation, of voice acting, and of how well it adapts not just the story, but the feeling that was present at the table of Critical Role's campaign. Season 3 abandoned almost all of that to tell a depressing, dark story of heroes unable to see past themselves to stop a greater threat. And by the end, whilst I enjoyed aspects, I've come away feeling let down by a show I love. I'm not a hardcore critter. I think it's part of the reason that I've struggled to write my thoughts about this season, because overall, I'm not a massive fan of everything Critical Role does, but I am a massive fan of Campaign 1 and Vox Machina. There's a lot of trauma and personal bullshit that led me down the path of watching Critical Role, but after Vox Machina, the drive and passion I had for the crew never bled over into their other live works. I still watch them. EXU and Calamity are highlights, and I'm still slowly making my way through Campaign 3, but the new characters haven't engaged me like in Campaign 1, and the tone of the table between the two campaigns feels vastly different. Not in a bad way either, let me be clear, just in a way that is obvious in the change. Also, I love Robbie Daymond, and him leaving Campaign 3, it really burst the bubble of my enthusiasm for it.
Robbie!
Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that whilst I enjoy Critical Role and most of the stuff they do, my personal connection isn't to them as a brand, but rather to Vox Machina as characters and the story that they told in the live tabletop sessions. I'm also vividly aware that changes have to be made. Season 2 makes changes that I adore, specifically around Kamalajori?
I am Kamalajori,
the Sphinx man. A sweeping change, but one that ultimately works for the sake of the story. The issue for me is that Season 3 buckles and falls under the weight of the story it has to tell in the time it has to tell it. And the result is a shocking decline in quality, right from the start. In the first episode, one that I consider to be mostly fine, we are treated to several flashbacks, a recap, and mostly filler to make sure everyone is caught up to speed. It's filled with a few changes that I like, mainly Vox Machina facing Thordak and realise they still need to work on it, and the plan itself is very Vox Machina. They make a plan, execute the plan, and
Expect the plan to go off the rails, throw away the plan.
though in the end, the ones that are most caught up to speed are Vox Machina themselves, as we, the viewer, having seen Season 2, already know of the greater plot Thordak has in mind with his ex. It was a rocky start, one that left me off-balanced and confused. I've seen the tabletop game and know what moments they want to hit, and whilst I'm not a professional writer, I've learned and written enough to know that it was a worrying start that put plot over character. The second episode wasn't much better, a mostly useless parade in Marquette to expand the lore, whilst also sidelining and butchering a fan-favourite character in Jumon Saord. It's especially bitter having seen the full season, considering that most of what happens in the Hells and with the Calamity character Xerxes could easily have taken place in Marquette and with Jumon Saord. I questioned the decision to go to Marquette in the first place. The only thing of note that was happening was running into Ripley, and we'll get into Ripley later. By the end of the first episodes, I was, for the first time watching the show, worried. The tone had changed, the characters much more aggressive and angst-ridden than before, and I say this having just finished watching Season 2. I was coming off the high of how amazing the last two seasons were, and the first 3 episodes were a bucket of cold water to douse those flames, because everything was incoherent, poorly placed and poorly paced. I cannot believe that they were using the "you spice" meme from the game.
Spice?
Yes! In such a ham-fisted way that, to those who didn't watch the tabletop, were probably confused as hell about. It's even more baffling because later on we got Goldfish Keyleth perfectly placed.
And turned into a goldfish.
That was a really good little Easter egg and made me chuckle. Of course, these episodes are released in blocks of 3. Honestly, one of the best ways to content drop something in the streaming age because you get the binge and the weekly way. Anyway, skipping ahead a week and at the end of the next 3 episodes, I felt relieved. The Hells arc was one that I really enjoyed. It was visually interesting, the character dynamics felt more to the tone of the characters, there was a bit more levity, of romance, and then a big old massive kaiju fight between two really well designed creatures. Vox Machina worked as a team to bring down Vorgol, and they had the final vestige they needed to finally take on Thordak. To me, episodes 4, 5 and 6 are peak Legends of Vox Machina, and the show at its best. They totally changed almost every aspect, yet it worked. The character dialogue was well written and acted to perfection, and the animation was beautiful in how off-putting it was. The Percy, Vex and Allura Kima romance reflection thing that they were doing was amazing, and for a few moments there was some tension that they might actually kill off one of my favourite characters. It changed what it needed to get the characters where they needed to be for their personal journeys and the overall plot. I also really liked the little addition to Pike's story as well. Ashley Johnson was absent for most of Campaign 1 due to being a big old success, so I really love that they're giving Pike some more narrative depth without massively undermining her overall arc. Her little devil's bet with Xerxes and the way they showed off both their characters and their deepest feelings felt really emotional, and since I'm a massive fan of Calamity, I loved the little nod to that special. Even though I feel poorly about this season, I still demand a fully animated Calamity movie or miniseries. I need it. I need it as soon as possible. Then we get to the third batch, the highest point in the entire show, and most probably the lowest for me personally as well. Let's start with the big one, Percy's death. Now, I never doubted that they were going to bring back Percy before the end of the show, and I knew where everything was heading as well. That being said, my fucking god, it's the single best episode in the entire show. It's tense, beautifully written and animated to perfection. Taliesin Jaffe proved in a single episode that he's the understated dark horse of Critical Role with a masterful performance that showed the heart of Percy during his most critical moments. The fight scene was the best the show has ever done as well, because it was so smartly written. You could see how both Percy and Ripley were using their equipment, the terrain, and their senses to their advantage. All the while, you're having the entire rest of the team go through horrific nightmares, keeping them separated from Percy as he fights for his life against Ripley and Orthax. At the end of it all, you see Percy almost unrecognisable from the man on a mission back in Season 1, finally self-actualising and moving past his needs for vengeance and offer Ripley a better way forward. Then he fucking dies! The 2010 CW music starts playing in the most emotional, most heartbreaking scene where Laura Bailey shows us why she's an award-winning actress. It's horrific, and it's a change I absolutely love. They really play into it as well. They have a whole ass funeral, and for the entire rest of the season, Percy's gone. He's done. Finished. Ripley escapes, and to me, this was a near perfect adaptation of how to do it, because this is the only death, other than Vex's, that truly means something to the story. After this episode, I truly thought that Ripley was gone for the rest of the season, that she was going to be a Season 4 threat, and I 100% believed they'd go back to the Hells to make a deal with Xerxes in the final episode, or Vax would make another deal with the Raven Queen that sets up the big one for the end of the show. Instead, when the next block was released, everything went to shit. I'm going to skip over to Ripley for a moment because we need to talk about Anna. In the tabletop game, she was hardly developed at all. We got hints of her throughout the Coma Conclave arc, but she was a secondary threat to Thordak, and the team was focused on the dragons. In the show, they do this incredible thing where they actually give her a lot of character and screen time, and actual villainous motivations, as well as a whole ass backstory. Her backstory was great, and I assume filled with teasers for their upcoming Mighty Nine show, but what made it so compelling was her motivations were very similar to Percy's, to the point where they were on very similar paths. When she left Percy dead, for most of the episodes left, I thought Orthax had left her, that once he got Percy's soul, Orthax would leave Ripley and she'd be on her own to continue her path. Then in Season 4, we'd get like a whole new Ripley arc that ties her up before we go on to the big bad. It's revealed in the literal penultimate episode of the show that instead, Orthax is still there. And Ripley is just vibing, making guns. She has a ship but a crew, and is just plain old evil for good now. We get a butchered fight of the Ripley fight, condensed down into just the twins, and after some shooting and fighting and for some reason faking out the death of Vax, we get the weakest how do you want to do this with Vex stupidly rising up out of the water and really slowly shooting Ripley. So she's just dead. This character they've been building up for the entire show, one they've spent time in this busy season explaining the sympathetic origins of, and letting her get away on like 4 separate occasions, just dies. To like 2 arrows. It's incredibly weak, really badly written, and worst of all, it's boring. Sure, the fight itself was fine, there were some cool flips and dagger throws and stuff, but it's just dull. There's no tension that Vex and Vax would get hurt, no tension that they might fail, because there's still an episode to go, and we've already had the big emotional death in this season. It's the first change in the show that I truly dislike, simply because it cuts off the potential they themselves were building up for the future. Ripley in the show has so far been a massive threat, and having the twins who are, with all respect, the could do no wrong characters, kill off Ripley without Percy or the rest of Vox Machina present, it feels wrong. It doesn't feel like the show, or like the tabletop. I hate to compare, but the tabletop game saw all of Vox Machina take a hit out of Ripley in one of the most brutal "how do you want to do this" I've ever seen. It was a moment of true rage, of the group losing their friend, and I feel like if they were just going to kill Ripley off in this season, why not do it in the episode they kill Percy off in? You still get the emotional death, and even better, you don't really get the proper release of having killed Ripley because your friend is still dead. Because unlike in the game, death is more permanent in the show. My personal opinion is that Ripley should have been the in-between threat for Thordak and the big one, and I'm incredibly disappointed the show felt like it had to tie up this plotline before the end of the season. So, my sidebar is done. Let's move on to the big, final, earth-shattering battle between most of Vox Machina and Thordak. The episode before the final battle is mostly filler, mourning Percy, gathering allies, and the most ham-fisted rally to arms from Rasharn, where she reveals that Thordak destroyed the home of Vex and Vax. Now, this was something that I thought they'd already done. In the tabletop, they did it when you first see Thordak, which would have been back in Season 2, but I guess they never did that in the show. So, with less than an episode to go before the final battle, the writers make the amazing choice to shove it in as a way to focus Vex. It's sloppy, but I can understand why they did it, a way to make everyone invested in the fight even after the death of Percy. The problem is, Vex wasn't honestly needed for the fight. I have a lot of problems with the final fight. I think overall the animation is sloppy and there's a lot of standing around and watching as hundreds of people get incinerated. Vox Machina never works as a team, and Thordak is taken down with only 2 moves, so it feels more of like a Deus Ex Machina rather than a team effort. There is no team moment that shows them all working together to stop Thordak. Rather, Pike just believes in herself and shoots him with a big laser, and then Vax shoots right through him in a fairly messy, how do you want to do this moment that didn't hit the mark and felt very hollow. There was no tension that this wouldn't happen, and it made the entire sequence feel like a pre-scripted video game cutscene, rather than a tense fight for their lives. I also dislike the flashbacks in that segment, and I really think they drag away from the moment. One would have been enough when Vax closes his eyes and sees his mother, but all of it mixed in with some fairly bad sound mixing, layering the music, the dragon noises, and the voiceover dialogue, really felt stilted to me. It doesn't help that it comes after a fight where Grog, Scanlan, Keyleth, and Vex essentially just stood around and threw their useless spells at an invulnerable wall of dragon. Far and away though, my biggest problem with that episode, and the fight overall, is the murder of Kishore Vesh. Everyone has their favourite characters, and sometimes, those characters die. During the entire campaign, I loved whenever Cash and Wilfredel showed up. I love him both character and actor. There was a point in the tabletop that I thought Cash was actually dead, and I was heartbroken. But he didn't die. He's fine. He's alive in the game. In the show, though, for some fucking inane reason, he's not. Cash has this amazing moment where he looks like he's actually doing damage to Thordak, where out of fucking nowhere, they kill him. It's jarring, quick, and brutal. And the worst thing about it wasn't even needed. We, as the audience, know the stakes. Not even 2 episodes ago, we just saw them through Percy, who, in the show, is currently dead forever. We know how dangerous Thordak is as well, considering he's taking on an entire army and winning, and the main cast can't even seem to do anything about it. Yet for some reason, the decision was made to kill off Cash. He's gone as well, like proper gone. Like, I don't expect them to resurrect him unless me shouting at Matt Mercer on the internet could do something level of gone. He goes with the Matron of Ravens, and that's it. Cash out, baby. What was the reason behind it? I genuinely don't know. Maybe Wolfredale cost too much, or maybe he wanted Cash to have a heroic sacrifice. It might be that the writers thought that when they brought back Percy, they still needed to show that death is permanent, and just randomly chose Cash to prove it. I'll be honest here as well. It was the point the show lost me. Writing this, I still can't see a reason past shock value to kill off a named character in the final battle against Thordak, let alone one that actually fucking shows up in the game past this battle as well. If we wanted shock value for the death of a minor character, why not bring all of the Slayers taken and kill off Will Wheaton's character? Not only would it serve as a nice little bit of tension, it would also serve as a little cameo for both Wheaton as well as his infamous dice curse. Killing Cash off to me screams of desperation and needing a shock that the fans at the tabletop wouldn't see coming. For me, it was the point where I was finally overwhelmed by the rapid pace and overwhelmingly dark tone of the show, and my emotions, like a light switch, flipped off. It's a stain on an otherwise brilliant show because already just the thought of re-watching previous seasons twists my gut because I know what's coming up. The gang beats Thordak in the end, and then Rishard betrays them in the world's most obvious betrayal. Scanlan goes into a coma, which makes sense. It has the weight of his death without undercutting Percy's, or, well, you know, I don't need to say it again. It also leads perfectly into Bard's Lament, even if Grog's fix him didn't hit as emotionally hard as it did in the tabletop. Honestly though, after everything we've gone through, whenever we had a moment to recover emotionally, to have that moment actually hit us in the gut. Almost everything I've said for the past few minutes has happened over the span of like 3 episodes, when in reality, this is almost the entire back half of a season's worth of content. Percy's death, Scanlan's coma, Bard's Lament, as well as Fix Him, and then also the death of a fan favourite side character in Cash. It's a lot of heavy emotional beats to cover in such a short time, and honestly, it feels like the writers were incredibly overwhelmed trying to fit everything in. Blah blah blah, they fake a few more deaths, Keyleth gets faked out twice for some reason, and has an entire season's worth of character development in like 10 minutes. They find Rashaan, she becomes Thordak 2.0 and dies instantly. They bring Percy back, and then the show ends. Sound like a rushed down version of events? Yeah, it's because it's rushed in the show. You also have to remember that during all of this as well, we're getting the Ripley confrontation, so that's a lot to do in 3 episodes. Actually, that's too much to do in the final 3 episodes, right? Rashaan and bringing Percy back is enough for the last 3, but they decide to really go all in and do both of those, and Ripley, and a new Keyleth adventure, and then a truncated version of Bard's Lament, which, okay, I know people are upset about how they handled Bard's Lament, and I'm a little upset too. Sam's monologue in the game is amazing, filled with some truly heart-shattering moments that ends with a member of Vox Machina leaving the group on a severely bad note. After the season we just had, the deaths and resurrections and everything else, wouldn't Bard's Lament have been that little bit too much on top? I think so. That's not saying they couldn't do it. In fact, I was expecting them to start it. But then they split the party, and in the end, the only ones that were even there when Scanlan woke up were Pike, Grog, and Kaylee. The best part of Bard's Lament was him ripping into Vex, Vax, Percy, and Keyleth, the mainstream romance characters that take a lot of screen time for their personal quests, as well as their romantic plots. I think there's a really interesting version of Bard's Lament where Scanlan starts ripping into them, lifting lines directly from the monologue against people like Vax and Vex, who, in my opinion, do kind of need checking, before Pike slaps him down. Because that's the thing with Bard's Lament. It doesn't work if Pike is around to check Scanlan. And in the show, she is. We could have had a really interesting and layered version of Bard's Lament, where we see Scanlan, a man pushed way past his comfort zones multiple times to fight threats he's never wanted to fight, and almost dying multiple times to fight them. He sees Vex and Vax and Keyleth and Percy all feel fulfilled in both their life goals and their personal lives, while Scanlan sees none of this. His time adventuring with Vox Machina is filled with danger he's never asked for, and he's constantly seen as a detriment to the group. And all the while, he feels like he's ruined his personal life in his connection to Kaylee. With Pike there to call out his bullshit, we don't get this one-sided Bard's Lament, but instead we get the counter-argument that only came months later when Scanlan rejoined the group. I'd have loved to have seen him get vulnerable, truly vulnerable in front of the group for the first time, and then realise that whilst he loves them and their family, he needs to find a part of himself that he didn't think he needed to find with Kaylee. The version we got goes along similar lines, but is much more forgiving to Scanlan, and to all of Vox Machina. He's much more mellow and leaves them amicably, which I still think is because of Pike's influence and how she cares and is shown to care throughout the show. I think the romance between them is much more subtle and the obvious teen level romances of the others. In the end, the version we get is like the Bridge Notes version of Bard's Lament, adding no new depth to it with the inclusion of Pike, but rather saying that because Pike is there, nothing as dramatic happens. That's where a lot of the dissatisfaction comes from, I think. The fact that instead of a new version of Bard's Lament, we got nothing, and are told that it's better because of it. Which, in all honesty, it isn't. It's emblematic of the entire season, I think. And if there was one overall theme that stuck with me after the season rolled credits, it would be fear. Fear of loss, of love, of missing your chance, and most importantly, of the future. Every character except Grog fears something, and every character at some point or the other has that fear realised through their own action or inaction. The only character who faces it and overcomes it without actually spiralling into an angst-ridden mess is Percy. And then he fucking dies. After that, the show never really manages to recover either. Everyone else devolves into the versions of themselves we saw at the start of this season, versions of characters that I didn't recognise. These were new, shadow monster characters that had no chemistry, no attachment, and no interactivity with anyone outside of the one other character they were allowed to talk to. It's a challenge to write about something as visceral as fear or hopelessness, because most of the time it removes the part of characters that people love to see. The wit, the humour, and the inventiveness. Bard's Lament was Campaign 1's moment of fear taking over, and it took over the character that provided the most levity in the group. It's part of the reason it worked so well, but the show decided to instead transplant that into the entire season and across all characters. So we ended up with no Bard's Lament, no Feeblemind, no Jamon Sa-Ord. We didn't get any of Kerrick to help guide Keela through her anger. Hell, I mean the Earthbreakers got more screen time than fucking Jarrett. The last 6 episodes leave no time for decompression, no time for the tension to release, no time for the story to breathe more than 20 seconds because there simply isn't time to handle the emotions of these massive moments because we have to move on to the next one, otherwise we can't do it all. Fear is the reason why the last 3 episodes feel so rushed, because in the end, fear of not being able to continue the story won out. And they didn't want fans to feel cheated for not seeing an end to Thordak, to Ripley, and to Roshan. In the end, that fear led to the compacting of emotional moments that left me wrung dry, feeling nothing, and having them leave no impact on me. In the end, that fear led to major plot points being rushed so much to be able to have a final scene where everything is being wrapped up with all the characters going on their individual journeys, that the ending was nothing but a slideshow of characters that weren't themselves 12 episodes ago. In the end, The Legend of Vox Machina Season 3 has some incredible highs, but also a drop-off in quality that I find hard to look past, as it takes a story that worked incredibly well based on random chance and improv, and squeezes it down until it's warped out of all recognition. It fails as a truly satisfying emotional send-off to these characters, and ultimately leaves me wondering what changed between the amazing adaptation that was the first 2 seasons and this one. In the end, I fear what's to come for the future of Vox Machina in Season 4.